One more, great. Okay, time to start. Good evening all, and welcome to the November 2022 meeting of the Royal Astronomical Society's Ottawa Centre. My name is Mick Wilson. I'm running the show tonight. Special welcome to everybody out there, especially members coming in from other RASC centres. Next, please, Chris. As usual, we're recording and it will be available on our website, ottawa.rasc.ca. Please use the Q&A if you want to put a question through to any of the speakers this evening. Chat box comments can be seen by all but aren't really monitored, and raise your hand is disabled. Next, please. We have a pretty full agenda, so skipping through after this introduction, we have some formal business. Mike Moghadam outlining next month's annual general meeting and the call for nominations for council positions. After that, Dave with the monthly skies for Ottawa. Presentation then by Tony Peterson and Andrea Girones on the active complex that dominated proceedings on the sun this last summer. Our break, after which Jim Thompson's got our techie tips for this meeting, and we'll give a hands-on demo on stacking software for image processing. That'll be followed by Hilding Neilson, our invited guest speaker, on the topic of space being part of the land. Jim will be back then with his What I Did Last Summer type presentation, a Beach Bum Astronomer's report. Then we have our usual observation reports, the challenges and the announcements. So with that, over to Mike, please.
No, not quite yet.
Sorry. Forgot our welcome to new members. 7 more this month. Welcome if you're with us, Lucy, Gregory, Robert, Jan, and Jeffrey. 54 for the year, not a bad number. Next, please, Chris. And of course, Andrea, in the news, twice up, please. Runner-up in the Deep Sky section for the Wilhelmina Fleming Imaging Awards for this year, as well as runner-up for her solar system entry with the partial eclipse. So well done, Andrea.
And the winner for the wide field image.
And did she? Oh, I missed. And there it says, and winner for the wide field image of the eclipse. Sorry, she just wins so many things, I get confused. Okay, next, please. Usual run through. Please join up. There are the membership fees. Why do you want to join? Next, Chris. Number of physical benefits. Access to our telescope loan library, the Fred Lossing Observatory, usually our book library out at the Aviation and Space Museum, and your ability to participate in the observing programs and gain certificates in a variety of topics. Next, please. Publications, bi-monthly Sky News, as well as the RASC Journal. The annual Observer's Handbook is yours as part of your membership. I received mine last week, and I've heard quite a few other people have got theirs as well, so an improvement over last year. As well, you'll receive our own Ottawa Centre monthly newsletter, Astronotes, full of fabulous stuff. My usual rant, the best thing about joining the RASC and the Ottawa Centre are the people with whom you will be able to share and gain knowledge, expertise, and actually learn stuff. So join up at www.rasc.ca. Now I think it's over to Mike. Oh, sorry, geez, again, Andrea, this is yours.
Yes, hi, thanks, Mick. I just wanted to update primarily a lot of the new members about some of the developments. Because we haven't been able to meet in person at the museum, it's been really hard to perhaps access some of the benefits of membership. So these are the announcements in relation to that. Number one, we have obtained a whole bunch of books from the library. We have taken them out and they are now available to borrow. So if you are a new member and you're interested in some introductory books, go to the website. There is a listing there. And there's contact information for our librarian. we do have the very brand new, hot off the press Backyard Astronomers Edition, which I highly recommend to a new astronomer. It has astrophotography and telescope selection and all kinds of stuff about the moon. We have that and you can borrow it. Secondly, we also have a members email list. Actually, we have two. There is a general one and one for people who are interested in the Fred Lossing Observatory. Because we can't get together and we can't speak to each other, the email list is a really good way to communicate amongst ourselves. So if you are not getting any emails from RASC, the list, contact the secretary and he will sign you up. We also have just published on the web a new member guide. And this is meant to cover all of the new, oh, thanks, Mick, things you might want to know when you first come to our meetings, when you first join, and it's to try to help people use all of the resources that are available to you. So I encourage you to go and read through that. And we've also updated the website to have a lot more contact information so you can email people and ask questions. Finally, this is kind of a plea to our group that I am looking for somebody, particularly from East Ottawa, to help with star parties next year. We did a lot of very successful star parties this year. I was the organizer, and we did them in Carp. And I live close to Carp, so it works out very well for me. But we would like to spread this across to the city as well. And I need another body to help me do that. So if you would like to bring star parties to your neighborhood, please reach out to me, and hopefully we can plan something for next summer. And that's the end of my announcements. Thanks, Mick.
Thank you, Andrea. We will see you later. And again, my apologies for fumbling on the prizes. So now, please, to Mike Moghadam for the formal announcements.
Well, hi, everyone. It's my job as past president to inform you about the upcoming annual general meeting of the RASC Ottawa Centre. It will be held in the next meeting in December the 2nd. Now, the AGM will also be announced via email, and there'll be a note in Astronotes, and it's already actually on our website. So one big topic. Next slide, please. One big topic of the AGM is the election of council members, and my role in this process is to serve as the chair of the nomination committee. And I'm supported in this capacity by two able assistants, Tim Cole and Gordon Webster, also past presidents, helping me in the nomination process. So our task is to seek out Ottawa Centre members and encourage them to volunteer on our Ottawa Centre Council. So briefly, for those of you, and really briefly, for those of you who don't know what our council is, it's a governing body for our club that has really two roles, an operational one and a strategic one. The operational one is it oversees operations and current spending. Strategic run, what looks to the future, what we should be offering to our members in the future. So the Ottawa Centre is an officially designated charitable organization, and this requires us to have a governing body with officers, council, and financial reporting. We also have centre bylaws and that define roles and conduct. The main task, I think we can go to the next slide, please. The main task of the nominating committee is to propose at least one person for each of the elected positions. Now that's done, okay? And in one case, there is 4. We have actually, note the councillor position. There's the councillor. There's 3 positions and 4 candidates. So in that case, there will be an election where members will vote on the 3 members, okay, the 3 councillors. So with that, and you'll notice here that we have one opening. We weren't able to find an opening for the 3rd national rep. Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. So, so while our role in the nominating committee is done, if you wish to be part of council, you can still submit your names and send an email to Chris Tarrant, our secretary. You'll need to be, if you're interested in being on council, you'll need to be nominated by 2 members in good standing, and you'll need to express your interest up to 5 days before the AGM, which is November 27th. Now, in addition to the elected positions, thank you, there are also positions appointed by council. So here's a list that the nominating committee has proposed to council. Now, council will consider these and make the appointments at their first meeting in the new year. If you're interested in being part of in any of these appointed positions, please reach out. Please contact Chris, Chris Tarrant, Stephen Norris, the current president, Dave Chisholm, the current vice president, or me. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, and again at next month's meeting, concurrent with the AGM, it's my duty to award two of Ottawa RASC's prestigious, awards, the Rolf Meyer Planetary Observing Award and the Paul Commission Observer of the Year Award. The process which I will go through for adjudicating these awards, where possible, will require submission of observing logs. I've already received one for this year. I am confident of receiving more, which I will assess and appraise as to their merits. Similarly, the observations that have been presented during our observing reports are also automatically up for consideration. So please, those of you who are interested in submitting yourself for consideration in these, please get those observing logs to me at sorry, just a message popped up there, at meetingchair@ottawa.rasc.ca.
Mick, the date on the slide doesn't exist. Today is November the 4th, so I'm not sure what your deadline is.
That was the message.
There's a little typo, and I'm the guilty party there, but from memory, it's November 25th. It's the Friday night before, 1 week exactly before the next monthly meeting of December 2nd.
Okay,
perfect. Okay, we had a number of questions came up in question and answer, so. I'm thrilled that people are watching that attentively and catching it. So
yes,
thank you.
And you will be punished later, Chris. Thank you. Okay, so with that done, over to Dave for this month's Ottawa skies.
Okay, let's see what's happening in the skies this month. So next slide, please, Chris. Oh, there we go. Well, the biggest news is we switched to standard time, which means on Sunday, which means that we can start our astronomy exercises at a much more reasonable time. Maybe when they finally decide to stop all this time switching, they'll stay on standard time. That is my hope. Anyways, let's take a look at the moon phases. So we're moving towards a full moon, which is on the 8th of November. But you see the full moon's a funny color. Well, that's because we have a full lunar eclipse. I'll talk about that in an upcoming slide. New moon is on the 24th. The full moon was known by early indigenous tribes as the beaver moon, because this is at the time of the year to set beaver traps before the swamps and rivers froze. It's also been known as the frosty moon and the dark moon. So these are moon phases. Next slide. Early this Tuesday morning, we're going to have a full lunar eclipse. It's fairly low in the horizon, so by the time you get to the maximum eclipse, so you need a place with a good view of the western horizon. So you're probably middle of the city, you're not going to see it very well, but you get yourself out in the Ottawa River someplace, and that's a good spot there, and you should be able to see it. So the partial eclipse begins at 4:09, maximum eclipse is at 5:59. Total eclipse ends at 6:41, and the moon is starting to set at that period of time. It's also going to be fairly bright at that period too. So something to look forward to. And it'll be much easier to get up because of the time change on Sunday. Okay, yeah, Andrea is mentioning that on the website you'll see the exact times. It's also in Astronotes. My slides are in there, and they're also on the well-provisioned website. We have the Torrids meteor shower. That's tonight, actually. And but it's a not a very active one, 5 to 10 meters per hour. We're moving towards the full moon. They may be difficult to spot, but don't fear. Next slide, please. We got a little more active one, the Leonid's meteor shower, a little bit later on in the month. And the Leonid's meteor shower is a little more active, about 15 meters per hour. Again, the second quarter moon will probably block some of the views for that, but there we go. Sun, rise and set. As you can see, there's a sudden jump in the times. That's because of the time change, but definitely the sun is setting much earlier as we move through the month. Mercury's rising and setting with the sun. There's not really any great opportunities to see Mercury this month. Venus is not visible. It's rising and setting with the sun right now. Mars is visible in the evening. Actually, it's visible in the morning as well. I was out really early a couple of days ago and taking my dog out for a walk. It was still dark, and you could see Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in the morning sky.
No, you can't see Saturn.
Well, maybe it's just Jupiter and Mars. Yeah. Jupiter visible in the evening. And Saturn's visible in the evening. Yeah, Saturn setting at midnight. So must have saw something else in the morning, probably another star. Okay, and Uranus visible in the evening through the night. It's at opposition on November the 9th, so it'll be the brightest opportunity to see it. Neptune's visible in the evening and through the night. And here is our cartoon of the month. So everybody see the mix set this evening? There we go.
Thank you as always, Dave.
Oh, you're most welcome, Mick.
And anyone that hasn't poked their head outside this evening, the moon and Jupiter, stunning pair at the moment. They're about a degree apart. It's a lovely sight. So thank you, Dave. And with the business out of the way, over to the presentations. So Andrea and Tony are presenting their material on a very interesting active solar complex that dominated the sun this last summer. For those of you who aren't familiar with our presenters, Andrea is one of our most prolific astrophotographers with over 84 submissions since 2021. She needs to slow down at some point. And a very regular presenter at our centre meetings. In real life, she's a lawyer, but otherwise an okay person and organises wonderful star parties. Tony, a native from Alberta, is a geologist and incidentally worked in Kenya at about the same time I was down there studying Shompoli, an extinct volcano down on the Kenyan-Tanzanian border. More recently, he's acquired himself a solar telescope, and despite his phobia of magnetohydrodynamics, statistical mechanics, and nonlinear differential equations, he's still fascinated by the activity on the sun. And so over to you two. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I hope you're well this evening. I pre-recorded this presentation as a video because I had a lot of stuff to put into it, and I was very worried I wouldn't get through in time. Didn't want to wear out my welcome tonight. It takes, you should pause that, Chris, and you're going to have to restart it.
This is not the video.
This is not video. My apologies, because it looks like it. Okay. All right. Anyway, yes, the video takes 28 minutes long, and I've put it on YouTube in case somebody wants to watch it again at a higher resolution. In August, I was sitting at the solar telescope and I saw something that I did not understand. I'm used to seeing flares, prominences, filaments, small scale things like that. But this was a blister on the face of the sun that was 700,000 kilometers long. And the more I looked into it as the weeks went on, I became convinced that it was, well, not an anomalous object, but an uncommon one and quite an interesting one. So the story of my understanding it is what you're going to get in this video tonight. I hope you find it interesting. Go ahead, Chris.
So beginning in late March, a series of exceptionally energetic active regions bubbled up in the sun's northern hemisphere. We'll call it a complex for simplicity. Well, not by coincidence, it's the same complex that gave us this solar happy face on October 27th. It's not a coincidence because to get a cluster of 3 coronal holes like this requires having something special in the middle. We're going to track this activity from May through October as much as possible. We're going to use our own ground-based hydrogen alpha telescopes. Andrea served as an advisor while I put this together, and she has contributed an image, which is arguably the most important one. So she is a co-author. However, all errors, omissions, and bad jokes are the responsibility of the first author. We'll also be using imagery from the Solar Dynamics Observatory to illustrate some phenomena that aren't visible in an H-alpha solar scope. And I'm borrowing freely from the literature on solar physics to get some illustrations because that's what I think it's there for. These will be of an historical nature whenever possible. Well, one manifestation of this energy was the formation of exceptionally large sunspots visible with the naked eye. This is SDO's naked eye, of course. You would need to put on a strong filter in front of your eye to look at the sun, unless you do it at as this photographer did in France. The major part of this sunspot group was active region 3014, which flared frequently as it crossed the sun in May. Here is a summary of the sunspot activity of this complex over 8 months as recorded by the SDO. In the upper left on March 29th, a single spot is present in the active region I'm going to call alpha. This point took 25.5 days to swing around to the same position, so all the other images are marked R equals 1, 2, and so on for the number of rotations, and alpha is in the same position for every one of them. Notice in the March image that there is a cluster of small spots ahead of alpha, but they have vanished by the next rotation when alpha has blossomed into 3 large spots, and a second active region develops, which I'm calling beta. The next rotation, R equals 2, the alpha spots have vanished and beta is now larger. It waxes and wanes over the next 2 rotations and it drifts a little closer to the equator, and then in August all spots visible at this scale have vanished and it looks like the story is over. However, sunspots are imaged at the bottom of the photosphere, which is the coldest part of the sun at about 5,000 degrees Kelvin. And H-alpha scopes image in the chromosphere thousands of kilometers above that, where prevailing temperatures are in the tens of thousands of degrees K, and up there the action continues. But before we get into that story, however, I have to make a point of order, or should I say ordinate, because the sun has a problem in that regard. Hundreds of years ago, European cartographers, like most people around them, thought the Earth was the center of the universe. So when they thought to depict the full moon rising above the eastern horizon, they treated it as a direction indicator and not as another world. The thinking was its left side is nearer the eastern horizon, so we'll call that the east limb. The right side, which you had to shift your gaze westward to look at, was termed the western limb. Oh dear. If you set up your lawn chair here and regard the Earth, you know its left side is the west side. The west side rotates toward the east side, and everything in the sky rises in the east, and on a map, if north is to the top, the west is to the left. Now, in the late 50s and early 60s, when planetary exploration became a real thing, and detailed maps of the moon and planets needed to be made, then to have celestial bodies labeled opposite to the Earth was clearly confusing at best, and at worst, silly and embarrassing. So the International Astronomical Union decreed, I think it was in 1961, that henceforth all other bodies in the solar system would be mapped as the Earth was. Now, I'm a bit cynical, and if I had written this story up for a newspaper, I might have done it like this. But happy ending. Now if you're making a map of Mars or Mercury or Callisto or Pluto or any body in the solar system, you should put west on the left. Unless it's the sun. On the right is a screen grab from the most recent paper on solar coordinates that I could find, and as you can see, heliologists have retained the geocentric system. I don't know for a fact, but I suspect it's because there had previously been decades, if not hundreds of years, of publications about rotation of the sun based on observations of sunspots. And so to flip east and west in the middle of their publication history, I guess was too much for them to deal with. Now, an exception could have been made for Venus, because Venus has a retrograde rotation. But if you go to the authorities, Wikipedia, NASA, anybody you like, they all say that on Venus, the sun rises in the west. My conclusion is that east and west have no meaning in space and should not be used really to label probably anything. When I talk about the sun, I'm going to try to refer to the limb that's rotating toward us as the ascending limb and the one that's rotating away from us as the descending limb. And this works whether you look at the sun upside down, sideways, or in a mirror. So we're in solar cycle 25, and it's proving to be much more active than expected. The individual points that you see are monthly totals of sunspot numbers, which are well above the predicted curve right now. If you were ever tempted to get a dedicated solar scope, now would surely be the time to do so, because there are 5 to 6 years left until activity gets below where we are now, and there's even a total solar eclipse visible in eastern Canada in 2024. Although whether we will get to see that in April is an open question. The model depicted here for the solar dynamo has now been refined by helioseismology and computer simulations, but it remains identical in principle. It shouldn't be solely attributed to only 2 authors, but it is now called the Babcock-Layton model of the 22-year cycle. Now, the sunspot cycle, which is only a measure of activity, is 11 years, but the dynamo cycle includes a flip in the magnetic field. So in reality, it's a 22-year cycle. We begin with an ideal pure dipole field. And here is the 211 angstrom image from the SDO at the last minimum activity point in the solar cycle on January 1st, 2020. This is an image of ultraviolet light that's emitted by hot ionized iron atoms in the corona. And the thing to note is, well, there's almost nothing to note. The coronal holes where magnetic field lines are unconnected are parked over the poles at this time, and they're very large. And here is the SDO magnetogram with calculated field lines at the same time. This speaks for itself. It looks like a very clean dipole field. Now, looking at stage 2, the reason the dipole fields are dragged inside the convective zone is that the magnetic fields are not strong enough to drive the dense plasma of the convective zone faster than its rotational and convective velocities, which are on the order of hundreds of kilometers per second. So the plasma drags the field and not the reverse. In stage 3, toroidal fields have been generated at the bottom of the convective zone. They are buoyant, and loops rise up and emerge into the photosphere to generate considerable mayhem in the sun's atmosphere. This is the hot corona image from mid-July 2014 at the last peak of sunspot activity. And here are the corresponding field lines in the magnetogram. These could almost have been drawn, I think, by Babcock himself. Now, we should clarify that although Babcock is popularly credited with this model, many, if not all, elements of it were under discussion years beforehand, as one can see in this 1954 paper by Parker. Now, I was very pleased to see that Walter Elsasser may have been the first person to think that sunspots are a result of emerging toroids, because I met Walter Elsasser when I was a graduate student. He even gave me a copy of one of his most recent books on the philosophy of biology, which I'm embarrassed to admit I never read and now cannot find. I don't know what you call this in heliophysics, but in geology it's called a heavy name drop. Now, this is the current state of the art in buoyant toroids. It's a numerical simulation that is widely quoted in the literature. The neat, clean starting toroid at time 0 is, of course, an idealization, but its location is not. They are generated at a boundary at the bottom of the convective zone called the tachocline, near a latitude of about 30 degrees, must be, since that's the latitude that they emerge at. Why that specific latitude, I'll address in a few moments. The essential point to get out of this is that the flux tubes get dispersed and twisted by convective motions and Coriolis forces as they rise, and they're likely to consist of many strands when they finally reach the photosphere. Why are they buoyant? Well, the strong concentration of magnetic field there provides a resistance against hydrostatic pressure and allows the plasma inside the field to expand slightly. That reduces its density and it makes it buoyant. I borrowed a figure from a similar paper to show the time scales that are involved in this. A rise velocity of 1 to 200 meters per second is typical, and a total rise time of a few days. and then the toroid hangs there for a few months. On the left is the August 6th H-alpha image of the sun, which has the complex in the northern hemisphere. And at this time, it just shows the aftermath of the emerged toroid. There was a very distinct equatorial coronal hole associated with it, as you can see. Coronal holes are completely invisible in hydrogen alpha image or any other emission line for that matter. Now, any large feature like this, it's about 700,000 kilometers across, is obviously related to convection in the underlying layer of the sun. There are some essential things to know about the sun as far as convection goes, which we should review before proceeding. First, the sun consists of about 73% hydrogen, with the remainder being mostly helium. It's at such a high temperature that electrons are bashed off their atoms by thermal motion to form a plasma, which is essentially a gas made of charged particles, in this case mostly protons, electrons, and helium nuclei. Well, current majoritarian thinking is that both the core, where thermonuclear fusion takes place, and the radiative zone above it are rigid, and they rotate as a single stiff body. Well, this is known to be the case in the radiative zone from helioseismology, but its cause is mysterious. Now, I've encountered three explanations for this. There could be gravity waves bouncing around in the core regions that rapidly transfer momentum so that they're forced to act as a single body, or the radiative zone is stratified into two layers and the resulting shear generates a strong magnetic field from a so-called Taylor-Spruitt dynamo, please don't ask about that, that glues it together. Or the core region maintains a strong fossil magnetic field acquired from its collapsed nebula, and I can actually show a picture of that. For a fine example of where such fields might be trapped in stars, look to the Orion molecular clouds, which are known to contain very strong magnetic fields. You can see their effect on related hydrogen alpha emission clouds, for example, IC434, right behind the Horsehead Nebula, where the magnetic fields force the hydrogen to stream upwards. In the convective zone, the plasma is fluid and it differentially rotates faster at the equator, just like in any other gas giant, such as Jupiter. It takes about 25 days at the equator to rotate once and 36 days at higher latitudes. Well, this is a cross-section of the sun showing rotational velocities in angular units obtained from helioseismology. In the outer convective zone, light colors are at the equator, where it rotates rapidly, dark at the poles where it's slow, and medium at an intermediate latitude where it matches the velocity of the radiative zone. It's the high shear between the radiative and convective zones and a thin boundary called the tachocline that generates the toroidal phase of the solar dynamo. It's difficult not to conclude that the toroids are accumulating in this little magic zone where the shear is at a minimum, because this would account for the general emergence of active regions at around latitude 30 degrees. But I'm sad to report I could not find a published discussion of this point. Now, importantly, like the core and the radiative zone, the convective zone is opaque to radiation. It's what we usually think of as the surface of the sun in the photosphere, where the plasma becomes thin enough to be transparent to light, which is a function mostly of density. And so the convection zone is very rapidly cooled at the photosphere surface, which causes turbulent convection that you can easily see as granulation in white light images. The photosphere is the coolest part of the sun, 5,000 degrees Kelvin, and all layers in the atmosphere above it are progressively hotter, which allows us to employ some very useful tools to monitor processes there. Well, the SDO obtains imagery of the sun in numerous wavelengths, and this figure shows a useful subset, most of which I've used in this presentation. I've arranged them so that the lower and cooler atmospheric levels are at the bottom, getting progressively higher and hotter, moving clockwise. Let me focus on a couple of these. At the bottom left in grayscales is the neutral iron 1 emission line, which occurs in visible red. This is strongly polarized by magnetic fields, so it's used to create maps of the polarity of the magnetic vector pointing towards the camera at the level of the photosphere. Now, this example is from July 22nd of this year. It's of the side of the sun that's directly opposite our active complex. Notice that the white positive regions precede black ones in the northern hemisphere, and it's the reverse in the southern hemisphere. During the next 11-year cycle, this will be reversed. From now on, I'll be showing versions of these magnetic maps with the calculated field lines drawn in. It helps a lot for interpreting any surface feature. All of the lines you see here are white, that is, they are connected lines. Unconnected field lines, which extend into the corona and the solar wind, would be drafted in dark gray. I move clockwise and we get to hotter emissions, notably hydrogen alpha, which emits in the chromosphere. Slightly hotter with some overlap, it's in the range 10 to 50,000 Kelvin, is the hellishly colored singly ionized helium-2, which is fabulous for imaging large filaments that rise through the chromosphere. On the right in gold and pink are two hotter emissions from ionized iron for the lower and upper corona. And the very top one, it's out of sequence for temperature as it's the hottest one that's represented here at 16 million degrees Kelvin. One of the emission lines is from iron stripped of all but 4 of its electrons. This line is very good for pinpointing very high energy flares erupting in the lower atmosphere. Well, here is my earliest image of the complex in May. The enhanced magnetogram shows that the sunspots in active regions 3014 through 17 are magnetically connected, but region 3011 curiously contains a high concentration of unconnected field lines in gray. Well, these continue off into the solar wind. They're usually more characteristic of coronal holes and, of course, the poles themselves. Here are some close-up crops, and I've included the SDO continuum image to show how different sunspots look in hydrogen alpha compared to white light. Note that in both images, the sunspots in region 3014 have not yet coalesced into single smooth sunspots. In this phase of development of an active region, the emerging field strands generate small spots called pores, which coalesce into the larger ones. As this happens, magnetic field lines are being crossed and broken and reconnected. This process can heat the plasma to extremely high temperatures and is the source of some of the most violent flares that happen on the sun. Before seeing some of those, let's look at a demonstration in a short clip from a documentary film.
Across the streams.
Okay, that's enough of that. So region beta flared in this manner all the time across the sun in May, but on May 20th it set something close to a record. It erupted in M-class flares over an 8-hour period, with the largest being M5.6. The 131 angstrom image on the left is better for pinpointing the flare locations, whereas the 171 angstrom image outlines the chaotic magnetic loop connections a little better. Now, I've been talking about flux lines and toroidal fields and such, and we'll be moving on to filaments shortly. So let's pause to recall the fundamental thing that generates all of these features. When a fog of charged particles drifts across magnetic field lines, and the plasma is such a fog, they are accelerated into helical paths. They become trapped by the field, and they also help to sustain it with electric currents. Regions in space that are dense in field lines can combine and entangle, resulting in a host of filamentary structures and a rich terminology such as you see there. Well, this is another historical figure. Note that I've dropped in the flux helix on the left to orient you. This is from Parker publishing what he admitted was Elsasser's idea, which is that a loop in a toroid emerging into the photosphere wreaks havoc and generates sunspots. Many details have been added to this simple picture since then, the most important ones coming from helioseismology. This picture by the Swedish 1-meter solar telescope must be one of the finest sunspot pictures ever made, because I kept encountering it in different publications. Indeed, the top half shows the granulation cells at the top of the convective layer very well. It shows the filaments of the penumbra and even gives an impression of the depression of the sunspot itself. And this occurs because it overlies a vortex of intense magnetism that penetrates down into the convective zone and stiffens it, so heat cannot be transported up directly underneath the sunspot. That is a direct result from helioseismology. When the complex came around again in June, it had new active region designations of 3032 and 33. Alpha had lost its status, and a new AR of 3030. The ragged spots from the previous rotation had coalesced into a larger spot in AR 3032, but numerous small spots are now present in 3030, and indeed 3030 was the site of many M-class flares on the day preceding this image. In July, Alpha region regains an AR number as 3052 because it has a small spot in it. The new active region of last month has now collapsed into a single spot in the positive leading area, but the trailing active region spot is breaking up and is starting to generate filaments. And now there are two large filaments, in fact, attached to and trailing behind the complex. This is a clear age marker in active regions. These filaments are generated by a process that involves cancellation of the magnetic flux. We'll get back to the southern filament a little later, but the northern one is of immediate interest. I was able to image again on July 15th, but I didn't get my first data until about 10:30 in the morning. By then, the segment of the southern filament that was attached to beta had faded, and the northern filament looked quite different from it did on the 9th. It was missing a section that was replaced by a disturbed area with a little bit of flaring. Well, fortunately, Andrea was set up and running at 8:30 a.m. that day and captured the image on the right, which shows the filament in high contrast. The missing piece in Andrea's image is a high twisted portion of the filament that had stopped emitting in H-alpha either because it was too hot or it had already dispersed, but it's clearly visible in helium-2. This time we have helium-2 on the left for the filaments and 131 angstroms on the right to monitor the flaring. After the filament erupts, it leaves channels of flaring along the path that it previously occupied. Now, that flaring was clearly visible in the 1030 H-alpha image. So these filaments form by repeated crossing and linkage of magnetic connection between small dipoles in the photosphere. And these will often become tangled, leading to wonderfully named braided flux ropes. The term sheared arcade arises because differential rotation tilts the dipoles, resulting in them crossing at shallow angles. And here's a marvelous little video made by Andrea, which shows the process of filaments forming in two mature active regions. You can see one fine filament in particular on the bottom left corner. And because the image is inverted, the flaring is the darkest regions. So here is August 6, just past 5 rotations. Over the last month, the magnetic flux has really decreased and all related features have almost vanished. A fragment of the northern filament seems to remain near beta. However, the southern filament is back and fairly well defined over the equator. It's the site of continuous weak flaring on this day. This feature cannot be attached in any way to the photosphere except at its ends, or it would be dragged at the equator into a hairpin, so it cannot have formed through a sheared arcade. Instead, it just seems to be a low-density flux tube entrained by the magnetic connection that beta has somewhere to the southern hemisphere. Next day, it disintegrates for good, and when it does, it triggers a cascade that wraps around the ascending limb of the sun, and it generates a small coronal mass ejection. Watch the bottom left of the disk on the right for that, the 171 angstrom image. These videos cover 24 hours. In September, there is nothing to report. Alpha has almost entirely disappeared. Beta has dissolved into a large positive network, a UM, a unipolar magnetic region, with many of its field lines unconnected, and indeed the entire northern hemisphere has suddenly gone quiet. But the next rotation, the entire northern hemisphere on this side awakens again. On October 2nd, the leading edge of beta had a small resurgence and developed a single spot. Now, this image combined with last month's gives a strong impression that either the individual connective toroids are linked or there is one giant one underlying this part of the northern hemisphere. I'm going to admit that this is well beyond my pay grade. Before we leave this image, note the beautiful curved filament in the southern hemisphere. This underlies umbrellas of connective field lines, but either side of the hairpin overlies regions of opposite magnetic polarity. If the filament has feathery connections with the underlying photosphere, then it must have the magnetic polarity indicated. We need to pay attention to that curious little spot in beta. It is by no means a normal sunspot because it is magnetically unconnected to anything else. It's acting more like a pole. Hint, hint. One more image, my last of the season, because the sun is now getting too low. The demise of the complex seems confirmed. However, a strong positive unipole with abundant gray unconnected field lines remains. Now, at times, the distribution of activity in these images has looked quite asymmetrical, even seeming to disappear over half the sun at times. Here's the sunspot images again. Asymmetry in activity between the northern and southern hemispheres is a known phenomenon, but I'm not going to be able to extract a signal from 8 months of partial data. Here's a serious plot of much more data. This figure appears in various guises in numerous recent papers. This one seemed the clearest and it speaks for itself. In particular, you can see that from 1960 to 1970, the northern hemisphere was almost continuously more spotted than the southern. The cause of this may not exactly be known, but there is a very strong correlation with a component of the sun's magnetic field termed a quadrupole. I found this paper to be good at pulling the threads together. If you can't bear reading the highlights, it's quite simple. There is a quadrupole field of the sun, which has a period of about 14 years, which interacts with the 11-year dipole cycle to generate a signal that apparently coincides with asymmetry in periods of about 8 and 50 years. In fact, there are some papers that claim to see a 150-year period as well, but this is sketchy. It's going to take a few more centuries of data to pin that down. Here's what a quadrupole looks like. At the top is a Cartesian projection map of a normal solar minimum magnetic field, one color at the top, another on the bottom. At the very bottom of the page is a quadrupole field from 1999. The ideal configuration would be a set of 4 positive and minus poles arranged around the equator. And note in particular the presence of several small little monopoles that are embedded in the larger fields. And finally, looking at the list of features associated with quadrupoles, we see that they attract mid-latitude coronal holes. Like these, I think. It seems fairly clear that beta is the site of a developing quadrupole, and it is likely to be a thing to watch over the coming months, because it will probably rise again. Well, that concludes the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. All of these references are available online. They're easy to find and they're free to download. And perhaps you'll indulge me in a little bit of hero worship at the end here. Thank you.
Okay. I'm here.
I'm here. I'm waiting to see if there are questions coming up in the Q&A. My prerogative as meeting chair always gives me first dibs on asking questions. If the quadrupole and dipole interactions are, if evidence for them is further developed, what is that plausibly going to do for our long-term projections about solar activity on, say, a decadal scale?
Oh, I'm afraid I can't answer that one, Nick. I mean, you're worried about whether or not solar activity is going to suddenly increase over the next few years to dangerous levels. Are you asking that question?
Or conversely, when the last solar cycle seemed to be going towards lower levels of activity, people were starting to mutter about another Maunder minima.
Yes.
So
well,
I'm just wondering what your take as an amateur might be on such extrapolation.
Well, my take as an amateur, I can certainly give that to you, is that the sunspot activity is much greater than was predicted. That seems like a bit of a warning. I suspect that major features like quadrupoles are going to allow a greater amount of magnetic flux up to the surface. And so there is a possibility that that would happen. There is likely to be a reason why quadrupoles are associated with solar maximums and not solar minimums, obviously. So, okay, that's my guess. Keep watching. Buy a solar scope.
Alrighty.
I own stock. No, I'm just kidding.
Alrighty, I mean, you've got lots of accolades in the chat. Fascinating presentation, bravo. It almost makes me wonder whether there's not time to pull together a sort of an ad hoc solar observers subgroup between the likes of yourself, Andrea, Jim Thompson and others that are really keeping an eye on this sort of stuff.
Well, Mick, if it's a secret group, it may already exist that you don't know it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's possible. Yes, the Illuminati are out there. All righty. Well, with that, Chris, I will go to a slide of mine because it's, I believe, time to actually propose a correction to part of Tony's presentation. Yes, the happy sun photo has had lots of traction over the last couple of weeks. In the week leading up to Halloween, Tony put it out there and was saying, oh, scary face, how good for Halloween. And I think you're wrong. And in fact, I'm going to demonstrate that you're wrong. And so, Chris, would you go to the next slide, please? That is, in fact, what was being presented to us. And again, the boreocentrism of this group makes us blind to the fact that the quokka is there smiling at us and hence really does need to be our champion for Canadian astronomy. Thank you. And thank you again, Tony. So, Chris, I think that takes us through to trivia. So a point to ponder while you're peeing. Which of these is true about the white dwarf star Sirius B? A, that it is the closest white dwarf to the sun. B, that it was the first white dwarf identified. C, that it is in fact one of the 7 white dwarfs near Sirius. Or D, all of the above. So we have our 5-minute break, and I will see you all at around what? Not even sure what the time is now. Yeah, let's say around 8:30. Thank you.
Mick, I have to intervene with one unfortunate comment. Normally during the break, I would leave this slide up for people to ponder the question, but in the background, I have an urgent request from a speaker to take down the slides and make a correction during the break. So as fast as I can make that correction, I will get this slide back up for people. So
Okay.
take one last look at it before I take it down temporarily.
This is an intelligent audience, Chris. I'm sure they can.
Okay.
Alrighty, so we are back in the land of the living. Tony, Chris has dealt with his crisis, his midlife crisis. And so the answer to the question, Chris, what is true about this white dwarf? It is the closest to the sun. A lot of sources out there will tell you it was the first discovered. They are pathetically wrong. The first white dwarf identified was 40 Eridani b. And of course, being such an important discovery, that has to be in the southern hemisphere. With that, we now go to, drum roll, and next slide, please, Chris. Our new and improved segment on everything that is needed. Next slide, Chris. In the way of useful information for novice astronomers who find getting started rather intimidating, or 10-minute tech tips and traps for tyros. Last month, we learned what color duct tape we actually need to use on our equipment. This month, it's over to Jim Thompson to give us a hands-on walkthrough, that most dangerous of tasks, of stacking software. Thanks, Jim.
All right, thanks, Mick. So before we get started with the actual demonstration, I just wanted to put this up for everybody so they're aware that there are some choices available for free software to do stacking. And by stacking, what I'm talking about is taking hundreds or thousands of images in the form of a video or an image sequence of the sun or the moon or planets, and then allowing the software to sort through all those images, find the best of those images, and build an average image for you that is sharper than you would get by just taking a single frame. So these three are the most popular softwares out there. They are free to download. Registax is probably the one that most people have heard about. That's because it has been around the longest. Unfortunately, it is sort of a dead software. The last version, version 6.1, came out in 2011. And since then, there has been no updates to that package. So it does have issues with later versions of Windows, large image files, starts to choke on the memory requirements. So unfortunately, it's for stacking, at least, a bit of a dead end. The wavelet tool for sharpening and the other image enhancement tools, they still work okay, but again, there are some issues with large files. So me personally, I use AutoStackert. They're at version 3 now. It's still actively maintained, but it is just an alignment and stacking software. If you want to sharpen the image or do other processing to enhance it, you'd have to do that outside of AutoStackert. Now there is a new player on the market called AstroTrivia. I believe it's developed by somebody in the UK. The link is there. You can check it out. I haven't experimented with it too much yet. I know Jim Sophia has used it successfully. It's a bit of a learning curve, but there are lots of videos online to show you how to use it. And it does everything all in one package. So maybe someday I'll migrate over there. But for now, I'm going to demonstrate how to use AutoStackert. If I could, I can just share my screen right off here.
You good?
Good to go. Okay, so everybody should be able to see my screen.
Yep.
So I have a couple of sample image sequences here that I've captured, 2 of the moon, 1 of Saturn, 1 of Jupiter. And I'm just going to fire up AutoStackert here. When you start it up, you get 2 windows. One window is where all of the commands are given, and then the other window is where your image sequence will display once you've loaded it in. You can choose to go through the open button, or you can simply drag and drop. I'm going to drag and drop this sequence from the moon, drop that in, get that out of the way. So now you can see there's my image sequence. If this slider, it's up in the top left corner, allows you to scroll through all of your frames. Depending on how responsive the Zoom feed is, you can see how terrible the seeing was on this particular night. It's quite
Again,
lousy.
that's good, Jim.
That's loud. It was, yeah, it was. That's good that you can see that. So yeah, seeing was pretty bad. So I got my fingers crossed that stacking is going to be able to pull something out of this particular image sequence. If you want to get all of it on the screen, there's a zoom slider here that allows you to zoom in or out, depending on how you want to work or how big your monitor is. That over there. So the flow is just, you start in the top left corner of the tool window. First, you start with the image stabilization. One handy feature to note is if you mouse over a command, you get a little pop-up that helps you to remember what that thingy does. So that's pretty handy. So you have 2 choices for stabilizing the image. if it's a surface type image, which is what we have here, you'd select surface. If it was a planet, so a full disk surrounded by black, you would select planet, and I'll demonstrate that on Jupiter in a moment. I usually use improved tracking. It says that it's slower, but with quad core or 8-core computers nowadays, it really doesn't slow it down that much. And then you have this choice of expand or cropped. So what it's going to do is it's going to take a feature in the image and find that feature in all of the images, and then move all of the images so all of that one feature is on top of itself. And that may result, because of drift, in the images moving off in one direction. And it's asking, do you want me to crop the result to maintain the original dimensions of the image, or do you want me to just continue to grow the size of the image depending on how much drift you have? The default is cropped, so I usually just leave it at that. The quality estimator, I just leave it at the default. I'm sure you could read tutorials online that show you how to tweak that, but I just leave it at the default. It seems to work pretty good. And then I click the big Analyze button, and it will do its work searching through each of the frames. This is a file of 500 frames. And one of the things that drew me to AutoStacker in the first place was that it's way faster than Registax. It uses multiple processors if they're available, and it is way faster. So it's already done. And you see there's a graph now here, a quality graph in the middle. And the green line is showing a sorted distribution of the quality of all the frames, from the best on the left to the worst in the right. And in the background, I'm not sure you can see it very well, there's a gray line showing how the quality of the frames varied in time over the course of the recording. So this is useful information now for me to decide how many frames I want to keep and put into my stacked image. The rule of thumb I use is I want to keep everything above about 75% quality. So in this case, that's it's what, about an eighth of the frames. So I will say, you can choose to say the number of frames or the percentage of frames to stack. I have 50 in here right now. So that's 10%. I could probably bump that up to 75. You have a choice of file format to save to, a PNG, a TIFF, or a FITS file. You can optionally have it sharpened for you. I usually leave that off and do sharpening afterwards. You can also do something called drizzling. That's where it's like an upsampling of your image to increase the effective resolution. I've played with it a little bit. It kind of works okay. But now, once you're ready to stack, you come over now into the right-hand window and place your alignment points. So all that's been done right now is all the images have been compared to each other and sorted in terms of what the software thinks is their quality. And the best quality image is the one that is now displayed in this window. And now it's for us to decide what in the image I want to use for aligning for the final stack. And you can manually draw them by just left clicking on the image. Or you can have the software put them automatically. There's a button here called Place AP Grid. So it automatically places alignment points. That's what AP stands for on the image. And it uses this size here to decide how far apart to put them. And you can click these radio buttons for defaults. And you can go up and down. And once you're happy with that, you click the Place AB button and it does its thing. So right now it's put in there 619 alignment points. I would probably go a little bit more than that. I usually try to make it around 1,000. But also you'll notice in the shadowy area here, there weren't any alignment points. That's because this minimum brightness setting is at 30%. I'm going to lower that to maybe 20. I'm going to lower this to 56 for the spacing and click it again. So a bit more of the dark areas got points now, and we're 885. I'll lower that one more. Ooh. Yeah, 1,300 points. And I've got my number of frames at 75, so I feel I'm ready to stack. I just hit the stack button and away it goes. And it's done. And it will auto save the result to a folder in the, it makes a subfolder in the folder where you opened the original file from. And it labels the folder based on what you asked it to do. So I asked for 75 frames, so it makes a folder with that file name. If we look inside, that's the resulting image. So actually, that's not too bad. Well, apply some sharpening to that and it'll look pretty good. I can't see. Close the window. So that is with something like the moon. Now let's try something like a planet. Oops, wrong folder. Jupiter. Drag and drop it in. So there's an image I took of Jupiter from a couple weeks ago. Again, you can use the slider here. You can go through the frames and you can kind of see, yeah, it was kind of a rotten night for seeing as well. So because this is a planet, I want to change the image stabilization method to planet. And when you do that, it'll automatically put a crosshair right in, it'll auto detect and put a crosshair right in the middle and say, that's your planet. And it looks like I got it right. And again, you just click analyze. And this is much faster using the planet alignment method. And here you can see, yeah, I didn't get very many frames of good quality. It was a pretty bad night. So I'm actually going to not do number. I'm going to say just stack 10% or maybe only 5%. That's out of 1,000 frames. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to, let's see what I get when I just place alignment points. Ooh, that's pretty coarse. Let's reduce the size to 24. Yeah, that's not bad. That's 120 alignment points, but it looks like the features, the banding is captured pretty well by those points. If I wanted to add more, I can just click with the left mouse button to add more and hit stack when I'm ready to go. And done. See, now there's a new folder for %5, and there's my image. And now you can choose whatever software you want to use to sharpen those images. I still use Registax wavelets for sharpening, but I have started using something called IMPPG. It's another shareware software. It does a pretty good job. And or you can use tools in Photoshop for sharpening. There's lots of options out there for sharpening your images, but that's basically how you use AutoStacker to stack images. Any questions about that?
Yeah, there's one from Doug O'Brien asking, can you show where the sharpening, the sharpening that is available in AutoStacker? Is that possible to do in the time remaining?
Oh, yeah, it shouldn't take any time at all. I'll go back. It's probably going to work better on the moon. So let me drop another, I have another moon sequence here. Let me clear that out of the way. So this is from the same night. It's kind of a rotten night again, pretty messy. Now, one thing that I didn't show you the first time we went through with the moon, go back to surface. It gives you a rectangle, and it's saying to pick your anchor. So it's basically saying, find me something in the image that is easy to identify, that has nice contrast. I can pick it out of the background, and I'm going to use that to anchor all the other image around it. So in this case, I would probably pick like this mountain range or the edge of Plato here as my anchor. So if you control left click, you can move the box around and pick what you think will make a good anchor when you do the image stabilization. So we'll just fire that off. This will take a bit longer. It's 1,000 frames. All right. Probably want to go back up there. All right, that's not too bad. That's 1,000 alignment points. And we'll turn on the sharpened. Ooh, blend raw for 50%. I'd have to read into what that setting does, but we'll just try it at the default and see what it does. Oh, it did 2 images. It saved the original stack, and then that's the sharpened. So it does do something. So that's the original stack, and that's sharpened.
That's great.
So yeah, it kind of works. It's not dealing with the noise. You'd have to do something to treat the noise, which you can do in Registax or AstroSurface, but it is applying a sharpening for you. There you go. That's a feature I've never used before.
All righty. Well, thank you, Jim. I think that's just 10 minutes up. 2 points I would like to emphasize. One is how brave Jim has been doing an online demo on an online presentation. And secondly, the fact that these tools are something that our members who aren't even images yet can be developing their skills with. All they need is a sort of a video sequence, whether that's an AVI or an MPEG type sequence that someone else has captured, and then hone their skills with that. Am I correct?
I would agree.
Yeah. And so all you budding images out there can actually start getting your hands dirty with image stacking, courtesy of this free software. So thanks, Jim.
Yep, you're welcome.
And we will hear from you on the far side. So Chris, please. I would now introduce our invited presenter as Dr. Hilding Neilson. Is of Mi'kmaq descent, and as such is an astronomer who integrates Indigenous ways of knowing and methodologies in his research outreach and science communication. His background is as a stellar physicist working with Cepheids and so on. He's currently an assistant professor and interdisciplinary scientist at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. And tonight is presenting us with his thesis that space is actually part of the land, Indigenous knowledges in colonization by light and satellite pollution. So thank you, Dr. Neilson.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let's hope my computer doesn't blow up trying to share my presentation. Can you see it all right? Thumbs up.
Yeah, you're good. That's great.
Perfect. So thank you very much for inviting me. As I said, I'm Hilding Neilson. I'm in Newfoundland Labrador in St. John's, also called Dunamgook. I want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk peoples and the Mi'kmaq peoples. And being here and being home is a very important part of being an astronomer, being a scientist, and being a good relation to the land. To start, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, Indigenous peoples have been on this land since time immemorial. And, we can all have discussions about what time immemorial means, whether you want to pick whatever theory for migration, whatever, but it doesn't really matter. People have been here for as long as we can remember. And that's kind of an important thing to consider, because no matter where we go in what we call Canada today, there are Indigenous peoples, whether it's Algonquin and around Ottawa, Mississaugas in Toronto, Coastal Salish, Inuit, Dene, and so on. And every square foot of this land has been walked on and lived with by Indigenous peoples. And that's important because that means Indigenous peoples have built a sophisticated and intimate relationship with the night sky. It is a part of where we live and part of where we are. Whether it's me leaving work today in St. John's and watching Jupiter hover over the moon, or watching the North Star in different parts of this country, Indigenous peoples have developed a science related to astronomy that is built of years and millennia of observations told through stories and oral traditions. And we can talk about this as a relationship with the land. Just as we know that Indigenous peoples have a relationship with trees and water and so on, well, that relationship is reflected in the sky, because it's part of where we are. Where we look in the night sky depends on where we are on the land, whether it's in Canada or anywhere else in the world. And you can think about it in terms of stories, because when we tell stories about astronomy, we're talking about our science, but also about how we live. And depending on where we are, the stories will change. And you can think about it, if we're in the Arctic or in Australia, we're going to have very different experiences of the night sky. For instance, if you're in the Arctic, it's going to be a lot colder to observe, but your observations are also going to be different. The moon alone is one very different object and different experience if you're in the north or the south. So when we do this, this changes our stories, this changes our understanding and the reflection. It impacts how we live with nature, how animals live with respect to the moon, and so on. This is important because a lot of this Indigenous knowledge is a reflection of certain understandings and ways of knowing. And I dropped the word axioms to describe this, but many scholars have come up with various ways of looking at this. And this is just a subset of ideas of how Indigenous peoples will look and think about living with the land or living with the sky. And fundamentally, the idea of the sky above is a reflection of the land below. And it might sound kind of funny, but if you're a person who's Lakota or Dakota, and you're around the Black Hills, and the sky above is a literal map of the land. Or if you talk about the relationship with knowledge, knowledge isn't something you have, it isn't something you gain, it's of action, it's a verb. And so how we learn and grow is through relationships. Many Indigenous peoples have a sense of understanding of a natural phenomenon based on multiple variables interacting. If you think about being a scientist in a lab, you might vary one thing and see what happens in an experiment. I increase the weight of the ball and drop it to test gravity or something like that. But for many Indigenous peoples, all these different variables are working together, and people learn to intuit. One great story about this is caribou migration. I don't know if any of you had seen caribou migrate across the land in different parts of this world, whether it's Quebec, Northwest Territories, even in Newfoundland. But caribou migration is something that scientists have had a lot of trouble predicting. Even computer simulations do a crummy job of predicting it, but elders and knowledge keepers, they know. They intuitive the migration patterns of the caribou, which vary every year to year based on, well, what scientists can't really figure out. And what's more, these hunters know how to vary small things along the land so they can manipulate the caribou migration. And so this is a way of intuiting or understanding multiple variables interacting concurrently. And another idea is knowledge is holistic, not holistic in a religious sense, though that could be it as well. But knowledge is a whole, everything coming together. You know, if you're in the far north and you're navigating by the night sky, you might also want to think about what the winds are doing, what the snowdrifts are doing, what other things are doing. So you bring lots of pieces of information together to multiple disciplines. Whereas if we're kind of in a university, I'm in a physics department, I'm across from a chemistry department, over the other side of the street is engineering, all that stuff, you know, where everything's kind of siloed. But most importantly, nature is familial. We live in a relationship with nature, you know, the trees, the fish, the water, everything has its own rights. And when we do anything with respect to nature, it's sort of asking, well, would we do, is that something you would do due to a cousin or due to a relation? And so all these axioms can play together to really change how we view science and add a whole new dimension of understanding, perhaps. And I should note, there is no pan-Indigenous knowledge system. Mi'kmaq knowledge, Cree knowledge, Inuit knowledge, Navajo knowledge, they're all different. There are a lot of commonalities, but they all have their own kind of behaviors and understandings. And we should never assume that there's like one Indigenous knowledge system. And, you know, and I mentioned about the Inuit and navigation, you know, if we look in the night sky in the far north, you don't see a whole lot of stars with the unaided eye. You know, you have the Big Dipper, you have Orion, and if you look close to the horizon, you'll see a star called Sigurd. And I completely mispronounced that because I should not try to speak Inuktitut. But Sigurd is a star that's close to the horizon, is used for navigation, and they tell a story of two foxes, a white fox and a red fox, and they're playing and chasing each other's tails. And when they're chasing each other's tails, you see red and white flickering back and forth, and it's the flickering star. And Inuit uses this to predict the weather. Because it's close to the horizon, the flickering goes through so much of the atmosphere that you can actually tell the difference between a high pressure and low pressure system coming from the south by southeast. And that means the star is important for, you know, hunting, for living on the land. More so than, say, the North Star, because the North Star is almost straight over your head. So, you know, that navigation is kind of pointless. And it's kind of funny, we get to talk about the star because Sigurd is Sirius. So it's also where the white dwarf is. That's what we just had as a trivia question. So I'm glad that wasn't planned because that just kind of made my evening. And if we're in Mi'kmaq, the land of the Mi'kmaq peoples, which is Eastern Canada and Northeastern United States, we also tell a story of constellations. And that story is told throughout the year. It is a story of a bear and a hunt. And the hunt is by 7 bird hunters, denoted by Jue, which is a robin, a chickadee, a gray jay, passenger pigeon, blue jay, and saw-whet and barn owl. And they're hunting the bear for food because, you know, out east, bear is important staple for the people. The fat is important for medicine, the furs for keeping warm. And so the story is about our relationship with the land. And we tell this throughout the year. You may recognize the constellation in the background. It's very similar to the Big Dipper, but with a few extra stars. But we tell it around 5 o'clock in the morning every day, because as you all know, the Big Dipper goes around the night sky every night. So, you know, if we're going to tell it throughout the year, we'll get dizzy if we're telling it at random times. But we tell it the story around 5 o'clock in the morning, so that when we tell around 5 o'clock in the morning throughout the year, it goes around the night sky again across the year. Now, I'm not a very good morning person, so I'll tell the story whenever I choose. But, you know, each to their own. And we start in the spring, because the spring is like the new year, things are warming up. And, you know, if you're out on the East Coast, it's already pretty chilly. So you're already waiting for spring. And we start in the spring when Muon is waking up from hibernation. And after months of sleep, Muon is hungry, as you would be. Muon emerges from her den, starts looking for food when she's spotted by Robin. Robin knows Muon will feed the community, feed the elders, provide medicine and furs. So Robin grabs his bow and arrow and calls his friends. Chickadee follows quickly with a pot. And if you look at the stars that are the star of Chickadee is 2 stars, a binary system. So the pot is also 1 star. And the other birds follow him behind to begin the hunt. And they're chasing Muon, and Muon is evading them. And as they go into the summer, Muon is running across the land. And Robin is trying to keep up and the other birds are still tailing along behind. But the summer, you know, goes long. August comes. Muon is getting tired. The birds who are at the end of the hunt, the owls, have fallen below the horizon. They've lost track. But as fall hits, Muon is exhausted and is done with it. And is done with this hunt. Muon gets on her hind legs and growls and tries to scare the birds. This is Robin's chance. Robin fires his bow and arrow and strikes Muon in the chest. Blood goes everywhere, covering Robin. Robin flies in the trees to shake it off, covering the leaves red, except for 1 spot on Robin's chest. Muon dies. The birds gather, Chickadee with his pot, and the other birds come together. They start singing, celebrating, telling stories, and they share the meal. They share the feast, because that's what we do in community. And they're sharing the feast and telling stories throughout the winter as Muon is in the sky, waiting for spring to return. And this story is essential to a lot of the Mi'kmaq culture. It is about sharing. It is about community. It is about when to hunt. In Mi'kmaq, you don't hunt the bear in the summer or the spring because you have to wait for the fall after the cubs are growing a bit. And so it's all about a relationship. And all the science of the land is there, along with the science of the sky with circumpolar stars, the North Star or Dadapen in Mi'kmaq. And it's all there waiting to be understood. And we can see it in these axioms. You know, the sky above is reflecting our knowledge below. All these variables working together with the ideas of Robin and a stained breast, or the owls following behind, and so on. Or the memory of the passenger pigeon, which is now extinct. And it's about our connection with nature and all these things. But this story doesn't exist everywhere. I don't know how many of you had a chance to take an astronomy course in university or any time in your life. But if you open up your astronomy textbook, I'm going to bet you don't see too many Indigenous stories, too much Indigenous knowledge. You don't see Indigenous constellations. You probably see the 88 constellations from the International Astronomical Union. And that's erasing Indigenous knowledge. And you know, and it's so important to kind of think about this way because, well, for one thing, why is the constellation a bear with a tail? There are no bears or tails. Like, I can rant about this for hours. Bears do not have long tails. I've watched Winnie the Pooh cartoons. I've verified this, and bears don't have long tails. So we have a constellation with a long tail. It doesn't reflect our land. But you know, about a century ago, 3 astronomers, a British guy, a French guy, and a German guy got together and they codified the 88 constellations so that we can map the night sky and make it easier. But you know, it's a British guy, a French guy, and a German guy. It's a bad joke. And so that erases our constellations. That erases our knowledge. And why aren't you working? There we go. This is what we have now, a stick figure bear that erases the stories. This is This is colonization, because the knowledge is colonization because it's disconnecting people from the land. And even though these stories have value in Greece and Roman culture, which are far richer than what we really work with today, they don't reflect where we are. And so our view of the night sky is really colonized. More so in the north, in one respect, with Camaradas and all these constellations that come from Greco-Roman traditions. In the south, basically by British and French explorers renaming the night sky. You know, the irony of naming galaxies the Magellanic Clouds, a guy who didn't actually make it around the world, you know, it is kind of mind-boggling. And that view is about removing us from the land. But it doesn't really matter if the names of the constellations and what we teach removes us from the land, because light pollution is beating us to it. I'm always in awe of this image. You know, this built up image of all the bright lights around the world. You know, I could see you in Ottawa. I could see me in St. John's. I can see the Nile River and so on. And it's such a beautiful picture of trash. This is waste. If we can take this picture from space as light coming out and emitted freely from the Earth beyond where we're using it, you know, it's not directing traffic, it's not directing airplanes, it's trash. And this is about disconnecting us from the land. You know, it's like we're afraid of the dark. And you all know this, you know, from the beautiful images and the teachings of how to manipulate astro images. You know, light pollution sucks. You know, when it takes away our view of the Milky Way, for some people it is a spirit road, for some it is a river. If you're in the southern hemisphere in Quechua territory, it is a building of constellations, dark constellations built in the gaps between light in the sky. And we have this, instead in a lot of the urban areas, we have this sickly orange glow that is unhealthy and disruptive. It messes with nocturnal behaviors of animals. I mean, I'm pretty sure, having lived in Toronto, the nightlights have made the raccoons smarter. And it is changing how we interact with the world. But of course, living in this world, now we have a new problem. One caused by the great hero of electric cars and the lies he tells about them, the great hero of SpaceX, and the destroyer of Twitter. You know, of course, this is SpaceX's Starlink satellites, streaks going across the sky as viewed by a camera in Chile on a telescope. Depending where you are, you can see some of these satellites with the unaided eye at different times of the day. The sad part is it's been estimated that about a significant fraction of these Starlink telescopes are already not working. So they're just going around in circles and junk. And also, Elon Musk has put up about 50% of the current satellites in orbit. So we've doubled the number of satellites in just a few years. And so it's like 5,000 to 10,000 now. It'll be 100,000 in a few more years. By the time I retire, which I hope is a long time from now, the sky will probably be blocked of satellites. Hopefully none of them would be giant lit billboards saying Pepsi, but that's possible. And this has a dramatic effect on doing astronomy because, you know, if you want to be a professional astronomy worker with the Keck telescope or Gemini or the VLT in Chile, you're going to face these satellites and these streaks. But it has an impact on everything else as well. What would it mean to see these streaks going through Inuit constellations? And it's always a tough question because, you know, these satellites promise internet, and Starlink does deliver internet, albeit really expensive internet. And other companies are planning to do the same. There's a Canadian company will be doing a satellite internet. There's OneWeb, and we're going to have these streaks. But maybe we'll deliver internet to places that don't have it, in the far north or in northern Ontario and so on, where the internet is just really crummy. My brother lives just a couple hours outside of Ottawa. His internet is pretty crummy, so he has Starlink. But is this what we're looking forward to in the night sky? Streaks covering Mewin or streaks blocking Zurich? what is it we're facing? And so it's important to note that if light pollution erases Indigenous stories, then these satellites are going to rewrite them. And we should be asking, is that not only is that what we want, but is that something we even have a right to do as a society or as nations or etc. And our view of the night sky is colonized thanks to these satellites, thanks to our naming conventions, but now so is the sky. This is an old map of all the satellites and debris going around the Earth. You can see the geocentric orbits, and then you can see all the other orbits. And this has been part and parcel with colonization and disconnection from the land for a long time. Even in the 1970s, when countries along the equator like signed the Bogota Declaration declaring geocentric orbits to be part of sovereign land because, well, those satellites were directly overhead of their space. Even though they were way overhead of their space, it was still overhead of their space. And the rich countries said, no, we're okay with that. And so, we're taking away space from other countries and other peoples. And it's worth noting that space is vast, but if we keep putting satellites in there, they can't occupy the same spot or the same orbit. So there's a limit to how much we can put in space. And we're facing that at certain times already when we have emergencies on the ISS with debris colliding with it, or different nations doing missile tests by blowing up satellites, whether it's China, Russia, or the US, who have all done this. And we have outer space laws. They're antiquated. The Outer Space Treaty goes back to the 1960s. And it tells us that we can't claim space or territory in space. Unfortunately, even though we all get emails asking if you want to buy a piece of land on Mars, we can't actually claim it. But there's a race to place satellites because this is a way of claiming it. If you stake your claim, you put down your flag and your pickaxe and you start mining, you can do this in space too. We can block, almost like a blockade, or parking your car in a certain spot to save it for later. And that's a lot of what it seems like these companies are doing. And it's important to ask then, who benefits? So far, the new space race is really, sorry, I'm trying to say things, make this comment in a way that's not overly dramatic, but it's basically a contest between rich people trying to prove how rich they are and out of touch. Whether it's Branson or Musk or Bezos, all plotting to be the villain of the next Bond movie. This is what we're doing with satellites and space exploration. And this is perfectly analogous to taking the land in gold rushes, whether it's the gold rush in Ontario in the 19th century, the Yukon, California gold rush, and so on. And this is kind of the problem, is that the idea is that outer space is supposed to be the province of mankind. Granted, and if we use updated language, the province of humankind, but this is quotes from the 1960s, of course. But it's only true for people with access, based on national and international rules designed by people, again, with access. For Elon Musk to put satellites in orbit, he has to obey United States law, not Canadian law, not international law. The US in principle is supposed to obey international law, but they're all vague, and if nobody's going to enforce it, doesn't matter. And this is important because we're going back to the moon. And we saw those beautiful images earlier of the lunar surface. And what are we going to do on the moon? Are we going to gather a few rocks to study to try to understand the formation of the moon, which was a great success of the earlier lunar missions? Or are we going to commercialize it, turn it into the lunar economy? And this is kind of important because this is really what the Artemis Accords are. The Artemis Accords are this new, or not that new, but agreements created originally by NASA and signed by the Canadian Space Agency, among many other countries. It's not legally binding. It's just a gentleman's agreement by different countries to work and together in space. And this is in the beginning of a new future of space exploration. And I'm sorry if you heard that siren. It's St. John's on a Friday night. And it's important to note that the Artemis Accords are very interesting. They're principles for enhancing peaceful relations between nations in space. So you register objects for international cooperation. So, no secret satellites, which who knows how many of them are in space, especially since, academic astronomy is talking about putting a new telescope in space because the NSA, the National Security Association, or whatever it is in the US, dropped off 2 Hubble-like telescopes randomly one day. So who knows what's in space? About protecting historic sites and artifacts. I think we all know what a historic site on the moon is. The landing spot, perhaps, where the flag is. But is that the only historic site of significance? If you're an Indigenous person, the moon's face is entirely historic and entirely significant. The moon is an ancestor, is a grandparent. So what does it mean to protect historic sites if it's from an Indigenous perspective? Resource extraction will be conducted under the auspices of the Outer Space Treaty. This is kind of a brutal statement, very kind of legalese. And the idea being, we can go mine wherever we want, just don't interfere with anyone. So we can have lunar mining all over the place. And of course, we'll have an agreement to process and mitigate debris in spacecrafts, which will be nice, but because there's a lot of debris in orbit already, and not that it's already going to be a problem. And this is important because Canada is the signatory to this new mission called the Lunar Gateway. This is a new station that's going to orbit the moon. Scientists and astronauts will work on the space station 1 to 2 months of a year. And there'll be experiments. There'll be a lunar rover, a way of going back and forth to the moon, the lunar surface. And it'll be a big change in how we operate in space. Since we haven't really gone beyond the International Space Station in a couple of decades. Since the last Hubble surfacing mission. And so this is going to change how we live in relationship with the moon. And this is really not about science. I sat in a information session about the Lunar Gateway with the CSA, Canadian Space Agency, where they're like, yeah, we're going to add economic benefits and we're going to do science. And when asked about the science, nobody could come up with anything. When you asked about the economics, it was quick. Medicine, low gravity manufacturing, mining, and so on. And this begs a question then, what about Indigenous rights in space? It's kind of something we don't really think about, particularly in Canada, where we barely think about Indigenous rights most days. But what does it mean to be Indigenous rights in space? If being in Ottawa, there's been a lot of discussion about the rights of Algonquin peoples. What would that mean to outer space in the night sky? And so, because it's important to note, both Canada and the US are built on Indigenous lands. No matter where you go, it's Seminole, Dene, so on, Stolo, wherever you want to go. And this is important also because not only are we built on Indigenous lands, we're built on treaty lands. Canada is built almost entirely on treaties, whether it's the Peace and Friendship Treaty out east, the number of treaties in most of Canada, the northern treaties with the Inuit and northern peoples. And these treaties govern how the Crown or Canada interacts with Indigenous peoples. And then there are a number of lands that don't have treaties recognized by the government, but those are unceded lands, so you still have the same issue where you have to respect Indigenous rights. But one thing that's kind of funny about these treaties, they say a lot of things no matter where you go. And depending on who you ask, they say different things. Like Treaty 9, what was told to the people is different than what was in writing. But one thing they don't do is set a height limit. There is no height limit to treaties anywhere in Canada or the US. And so when we talk about the treaties, we have to think about the night sky. And we have to think about space. And what does it mean to have Indigenous interaction or Indigenous interactions with Indigenous peoples with respect to space? And this means we have to we should be thinking of space as part of our conversation with Indigenous peoples and how we live on this land. In the same way we talk about treaties and reserves on the land, or mining rights or water rights and so on. And this is important because for a lot of people, the sky above is a commons. You know, I think I'm not saying anything kind of just crazy when I say everyone has an interaction with the sky at some point in their life. Whether it's looking at the stars or looking at the moon or looking at meteor showers, everyone has an interaction and we all have a right to that. But being on this land also means how we operate with satellites, light pollution, space exploration, space economies, means we have an obligation to consult and interact with Indigenous communities and nations. So Indigenous peoples should be part of this conversation, and part of that is our responsibility for our future in space. Because right now, what we're doing is being done in space is basically trashing it. In the same way, we've spent decades trashing the ocean, decades trashing the land, trashing the environment. We're doing it in space. Our environment has, from a Western perspective, has grown, and we're in space. And so if the sky, moon, space are part of Indigenous cultures and a part of Indigenous ways of being and knowing, then the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, something that Canada claims to uphold, provides rights to equitable access to the sky and space. So part of our understanding then is we should be thinking about how Indigenous peoples can lead our ways in space, not just the CSA, not just whatever rich fool wants to go waste his money. And I think that begs the question then, how do we do that? And I don't expect the Canadian government is going to acknowledge this treaty thing in any way, or I don't think the courts are going to overturn it. I mean, Indigenous peoples in Canada have enough issue with the Canadian government and the courts. So maybe we could think of something smaller. I don't know how many of you read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, but Robin Wall Kimmerer discusses how we can interact with nature, and that when we take from nature, we give something back. That when we take medicine, we leave a gift. We never take the first piece of medicine or plant or animal we see. We take the second or third, so that way there's always more left. And how do we do this in space? Because a lot of times we think of space as something that's dead or something that's empty. You know, what's the line in space? No one can hear you scream. You know, that's a way of thinking of space as something that's dead and vacuous, but it's really alive. There's particles, maybe low density particles, but there's particles. There's light, there's photons, there's neutrinos, and in its own way, it's alive. And so we need to rethink this view of how we view space and get back to it. How we go from having this constellation dictate our relationship with the land. Nope. My transitions are slow, I apologize. How we go from having this relationship with the land and the sky to having something that looks like Muin, or if you're in Cree territory, the Great Bear, or if you're in Lakota territory, a pot or crib, and so on. And in parts of Europe, bear and cubs, and so many things. So things we can do. And it's always important to think about this. You know, I think it's we should be fighting light pollution. And I think as enthusiasts, we can all agree light pollution sucks. We should be thinking about the stories of the night sky. The constellations are a map. And part of the disposition of Indigenous peoples from the land and maps is how we draw maps. If we call something Ottawa or Newmarket or New Westminster or whatever, using names from Europe or anglicized names of Indigenous words, we're trying to disconnect and change the names of the maps. And this was done in colonization historically. When the first English and French settlers came to Nova Scotia, they used the Mi'kmaq names. But 50 years later, they're all English in different names. And that was a way of dispossessing people from the land. And we should be thinking about Indigenous knowledges and all these aspects of what we do. For instance, it was earlier mentioned the local name of the moon and thinking about what that means in this time of year. And we have similar names of moons in Mi'kmaq. And I think what's most important is we should acknowledge that moon, Mars, space, the night sky has its own intrinsic rights. And that's something that's not human. Having an intrinsic rights is probably awkward for many of us, and that we don't know what that means. But I think what it means, at least to me, is we don't have the right to go and just treat it as a resource for our consumption. That the moon has a right to exist in its own way. That if we ever want to go to Mars, it has a right to exist in its own way. And, and I'm all for sending Elon to Mars, just as long as there's no return trip. But that's the only one. We can leave him there. That could be our gift to Mars. But we need to respect these rights and respect our place in that. And I think we all try to do this as astronomers when we explore the night sky and live and have this relationship. But that relationship needs to be for everyone, and in their own cultures, in their own languages, in our own lands. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and hope we can have a conversation.
Well, thank you, Hilding. I mentioned earlier my chair's prerogative to always lead off with the first question. I can't. I have so many questions. I have so many thoughts. I think back to my own time in the US and the UN, and working with the Office of Outer Space Affairs and trying to have the environment program strike an agreement with the International Dark Sky Association on issues around light pollution, about getting international semi or perhaps actually legal agreements in place. It's a huge topic, and I really, really don't know where to start. As I'm looking at the questions, I don't see anything that's come up. I see lots of comments in the chat resonating with your points. If there's someone who's been up on the chat who now wants to put a question through for Dr. Neilson, here's your time. Yeah. Again, I'm seeing comments. Thank you, Dr. Hilding. Dr. Neilson, what an inspiring and motivating talk.
Thank you.
I think we need to get you back. I think we need to continue this conversation. Would you be up for that?
Easy. You know where to find me. Yeah? Sure.
Okay, well, I think you'd be welcome, and I hope to be in contact with you in the new year. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty, Chris.
Yes.
In the interest of time, Jim has agreed to. Oh, hang on, there is a question came up. I will. I don't think we've got time to handle that. In the interest of time, Jim has agreed that his beach bum presentation will be given in December.
Thank you so much, Jim. I look forward to his, but seeing the time and knowing what's coming, it's a wise move to.
We've got
do
lots
that.
of observations to get through. So, please, Chris, if you can move us to the observation reports. Thank you.
So we'll start with Jim Sophia.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me well?
Hear you fine, Jim.
Excellent. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Well, you may know that Jupiter reached opposition to Earth on September 27th, just 3 days after I took this image from my downtown Ottawa balcony. All images that I'm presenting I took with a Celestron 8-inch Smith Cassegrain scope, a Mellencamp Skyraider camera, and a 2x Barlow lens with a Beta UV IR cut filter. So with this image, I began taking a video of Jupiter with the camera, capturing about 1,200 frames, and I later stacked them using AstroSurface, a software program that I've recently heard about and learned about. Now, compared to Registax and AutoStacker, as Jim mentioned previously, AstroSurface offers additional processing options after stacking is completed. So I'm really pleased with the performance of this program. Next image, please. And here is another capture of Jupiter with one of its moons, Ganymede. And I didn't notice how clear this moon would show up until after the stacking was completed. So I was pleasantly surprised. Next one, please. So this is Mars, and as you may have already seen, that Mars rises quite high in the sky during the night. It was at a mere 40 degrees in altitude when I took this shot at 12:30 a.m. a couple of weeks ago. And while the seeing was below average, not that great, you can still make out the northern polar region, some topography of Syrtis Major and Mare Turinum, and below that, the roundish bright area called Hallis Basin. Next one, please. And this is the last image, our sixth planet from the sun, Saturn. Thank you very much.
Moving on to Andrea.
Oh, this is a picture that I took near the cottage on the beach, obviously. I was going to be shooting the Milky Way, and I was waiting for the moon to set, and I ended up getting this picture. It was actually a little tiny crescent moon, but because I had to expose for about 30 seconds for the Milky Way, I caught quite a overexposed moon, but it made kind of a pretty reflection. So this is with an Astro modified DSLR, 20 millimeter lens, and it was a 30-second exposure, ISO 1600. I think it was, a stack for the sky that I blended with a long exposure for the foreground. Next, please. And this was actually one of the active regions that Tony was speaking about. This, you'll remember last month I presented the M-class flare that I caught on video. This the sunspot region you see in the upper northeastern part of the sun is that same area. And this was imaged October 5th It was with my little Lunt 40mm solar scope, and it's a 2-panel mosaic with a 290 monochrome camera. Next, please. And this image was earlier in the month, September 24th, and it was just a very large prominence that was very visible off the edge of the sun. And below it was, again, a very large active region, sunspot area 3107, I believe, which also had a lot of flares. And this was the part of the sun that I did do a time-lapse video of. I think Tony has already showed it in his video. So Chris, if you want, you can just skip over it. This time lapse, I believe, is about 3 hours every 45 seconds, and it is inverted. So when you see a dark patch, that's actually a very bright exposed, overly exposed flare. And the sunspots show up as white in the inverted image. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you. We'll let that video finish. We had to see it again. Thanks so much. And now we move to Oscar, the author of our observing challenges.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
All right, so this is an image of the Crescent Nebula, NGC 6888. It's an emission nebula in Cygnus, about 5,000 light years away. It's formed by the fast stellar wind of Wolf-Rayet star 136 colliding with and energizing the slower moving wind ejected by the star when it became a red giant some 250 to 400,000 years ago. The image was taken on the nights of July 30th, August 2nd, 5th, and 26th this past summer in my backyard, and then one night from Starfest. It was taken through an 80mm Skywatcher Equinox AED at f5 using an S-Big STC7 monochrome camera. I've got an hour and 40 minutes in blue, an hour and 5 minutes in green, hour and 30 minutes in red, 3 hours and 50 minutes in hydrogen alpha, and 2 hours, 35 minutes in luminance for a total integration of 10 hours, 40 minutes. Next one, please. This is Myrex Ghost, NGC 404, which was the advanced challenge last month, I believe. It's a lenticular galaxy 10 million light years away in the constellation Andromeda. It's considered a field galaxy, meaning it's not known to be part of any cluster and is considered to be gravitationally alone. This can be a pretty tough object to spot visually in image because it's only about 7 arc minutes away from second magnitude Myrac. I took this image on October 24th through my 11-inch Celestron Edge HD and a ZWO ASI 2400. It's 80 45-second sub-exposures for about an hour of integration. Next one, please. This is NGC 281, or the Pac-Man Nebula. It's a bright emission nebula and part of an H2 region in the constellation Cassiopeia, located about 9,500 light years away. It features multiple B1 stars and several Bok globules. This image was taken October 27th through my 11-inch Edge HD, again with the same ASI 2400 MC Pro camera. It's 113 3-minute exposures for a total of 5 hours and 39 minutes of integration. Next one, please. This one here is the Ghosts of Cassiopeia. The Ghosts of Cassiopeia are IC 59 and 63. It's a reflection and emission nebulas in the constellation Cassiopeia, some 550 light years away. The nebula is shaped and energized by the solar wind from the blue-white subgiant Gamma Cassiopeiae, which is the really bright star in the frame at the top left. I took this image on the 22nd and 29th of October, again through the same setup, 11-inch Edge HD and the 2400 MC Pro. It's 233, 180 second sub-exposure, so 11 hours and 39 minutes of data. And this was the intermediate challenge, I believe, for the month. You notice that the three challenges I chose were all ghost related there. There was The beginner challenge is the Pac-Man Nebula, and for those of you who have played Pac-Man, there's little ghosts in there. Myrex Ghost and the Ghost of Cassiopeia. And that was my Halloween treat for the club. Next one, please. And this is the Dark Shark Nebula, or LDN 1235. It's a dark nebula in the constellation Cepheus, about 650 light years away. It's comprised of dark dust, which is faintly lit by the surrounding stars. The small yellowish spiral galaxy near the top right of the frame is PGC 67671, and it's located 58 million light years away, making that object 88,000 times farther away than the foreground nebula, which I think is pretty cool that there's such a contrast in distance there. I took this image on September 29th and October 2nd through the 80 millimeter refractor I talked about earlier, again with the SBIG STC7 monochrome camera. An hour and 36 minutes in each of red, blue, and green, and 7 hours, 36 minutes in luminance, for a total of 12 hours and 24 minutes. That's it for me this month.
Great images. Thank you so much, Oscar. We'll move now to Richard Taylor and thank him, by the way, for his offer to continue on as our treasurer next year. He does yeoman work for the club, and it's really appreciated.
Okay, so I think Mick put us in the wrong order, because I'm going to show the same pictures as Oscar just showed, but using a much smaller telescope and much less integration time. So here's this Pac-Man Nebula again. This was taken on October 21st at FLO, and I had to cut my exposure short because this object is really high in the sky, and my camera started bumping into the tripod head. So it's only about less than an hour of integration time. Next one, please. And here's my version of the Ghost of Cassiopeia. Of them fairly clear. You can just make out the second ghost up near the top left as well. Next one, please. And here's the Ghost of Merak. Now, I didn't find this very challenging. It turned out that with the camera, it's fairly easy to get this little galaxy close to the bright star, but I presume that trying to do it observationally with just looking at it with your eye, you'd be blinded by the very bright star and wouldn't be able to see the galaxy very well. Next one. And here's the lunar challenge, Mare Anguis, the Serpent Sea. It happens that it's quite easily visible right now on the moon. I saw it also last night. This is from just a few nights ago, the 1st of November. I was mainly out there taking pictures of Jupiter, but the moon was sort of in amongst the trees. It's so low in the sky right now, but I did manage to catch it between branches. So there we have all 4 of the challenge objects for this month. Next one, please. And then on the 27th of October, I had my first solo flight on the Paul Commission telescope, the 14-inch Meade at FLO. It still isn't completely calibrated for go-to capability, so I chose an object that's very easy to find, M57, the Ring Nebula. And I found that when I pointed the finder scope at the 2 lowest stars in Lyra, halfway in between is the Ring Nebula, so it was fairly easy to find the location. And I was lucky enough to see it in the very tiny field of view of the telescope when I turned on the camera. So I was able to send to that object, and this is 39 20-second exposures through the 14-inch. Now, this was using my Canon M100 camera, which is not astro modified. So it's not very sensitive to the red and infrared ends of the spectrum. So you're seeing mostly the blue glow, I guess it's the oxygen line, and the red surrounding hasn't come through very well at all. So I think that would work better with an astro modified camera or a dedicated astro camera. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. We'll move on to one of our most prolific contributors every month of images, Bob Olson.
How you doing?
Wonderful. How are you at West?
Yeah, freezing to death. I was web surfing one evening, and I found a fantastic image of this object, so I thought I'd try it. And I imaged it for 5 nights, and this is all I got out of it. The moon was too much in the sky, so it was not so good. The other thing is I almost missed the object. It's really the bright nebula on the left edge. I'll try it again another time. Next image, please. We had some steady skies at the beginning of October, so I aimed at M1, and for 7 hours I got red, green, and blue. I'm finding that I get better color when I don't use a luminance frame in my images. There's some very nice detail in this, better than I've ever had before because of the steady seeing. I did try 6 hours of hydrogen alpha when the moon came up, but the moon was too bright even for hydrogen alpha. The Crab Nebula is a remnant from a supernova that exploded in the year 1054. Next image, please. This is a challenge object. It's about 33,000 light years from Earth. It is orbiting the Milky Way in the opposite direction as everything else. So it is probably left over from a collision with a dwarf galaxy. Maybe Omega Centauri is the core of that colliding galaxy. Next image. Challenge object, named for the Pac-Man computer game that has been mentioned before. Again, nice detail in the nebulosity, as were in the other images shown tonight. Next, please. This is my my ghost image. It's a challenge object again. Could you show the next image, please? Yeah, Merak, Mag 2.4, and the ghost. It's a little free-floating galaxy, not near anything else. And observing it is just like looking at a squirrel under headlights, sitting on the hood of your car, looking into the headlights at night. It is really hard to see. But as mentioned before, cameras will shoot through the haze and get you a pretty good image. Next image, please. Another challenge object, the Blue Flash Nebula. I wonder why it's called that. It's about 7,500 light years from Earth. Next image, please. And it's got some interesting detail when I do a crop and get a little closer. The central star may also be a binary star. Next image, please. This is the Skull Nebula. It's around 1,600 light years away. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, that's NGC 255, and it's 60 million years away distance from here. Next image, please. Image we've seen already. This is another challenge object. It's the nebula is about 550 light years away, not really very far away. The bright star is the middle star of the W in the constellation Cassiopeia. It is also about 550 light years away. It's probably creating this nebula. Okay, next image. And this is what they're called. As you might imagine, a bright Mag 2 star will swamp a faint nebulosity badly. Come back next month and I will explain how I reduced the star's glare to allow the nebula to show it all. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And last, because I always put these images in the order that they're submitted. So reliably, Paul will always come in the last minute, but always come in.
That says something to me, Chris. That's Tardy is my middle name anyway.
But absolutely reliable and consistent.
Well, at least I'm that, right? Okay, I am gonna stop my video because I am getting chopped here. So hopefully this will make things sound a bit more smoothly, and you already know what I look like. So I'm gonna just stop this here.
You sound fine, Paul.
Do I? Okay, because
yeah.
My internet over the last little while has been very crappy, if I can put it that way. And I know I've had this conversation with others there, and I'm not really into supporting Elon Musk and Starlink, because I'm actually quite ticked off that he is polluting our sky, as we heard earlier this evening. Anyway, so yeah, my internet is marginal, but I can hear you now, and hopefully it'll hold while I do my thing. All right, so well, good evening, everybody, and just go through these things fairly quickly because we're already running a fair bit over, and I just want to give you a few peeks of something that are going on. As Dave mentioned, the torrid meteor shower peaks tomorrow, and unfortunately, the moon will only be about 3 days away from full, and so the sky is going to be quite bright if it's even clear at all. Just a bit more detail on the torrids, because they're interesting this year. The torrids are actually two streams, the north and the south torrids. It's the south torrids that peak tomorrow night, and the north torrids peak a week later on November the 12th. While these meteor showers, typically the peaks, they're not very active showers with only 10 to 15 meteors per hour. But interestingly, there are modeling estimates that indicate that this year's showers may produce an increased number of very bright meteors referred to as fireballs or bolides. In addition, the peaks of these showers are quite broad, meaning that the meteor streams may produce bright meteors for a few weeks on either side of these peak dates that I've mentioned. So if it's cloudy tomorrow night or the moon is bothering us in the next week, if you're out there, keep an eye to the sky there. I've seen a number of bright meteors. I haven't seen what I would call a fireball. And I've also been trying to capture them. This is just one image that I thought I'd show you. Basically, what I've been doing is just setting up a DSLR camera with a wide angle lens on a stationary tripod, so nothing really fancy, and taking 30-second exposures one after the other for about 6 hours in the evening. So I'm basically shooting, 1,000 or so frames there, and then going through and seeing if I got lucky with any of the torrids. I haven't captured a really, really bright one. This was one of the nicest ones that I captured, as you can see, because there's some other interesting objects in the field of view. You can see that at the top right, we've got Mars. Shining is very obvious and reddish in color, and then down near the center of the image there, we've got the Hyades star cluster with Bright Aldebaran at one of the points of the Hyades, and we've also got the Pleiades. So next one there, Chris, please, and here we go. So on this slide, I've just marked where the radiant points of these showers are, approximately the area of the sky where the meteors seem to be coming from when the Earth intercepts the orbital paths of the swarm. These are approximate locations because they do change as the Earth moves in its orbit around the sun. But you can see that this meteor, this one that I captured here, seems to have been coming from probably closer to the south toward radiant than north, but they're all both in the same ballpark there. So again, if you have an opportunity to spend some time, certainly we've had some mild nights, and I think it's cloudy tonight, but the forecast low out here tonight is, my place is about 15 degrees. So enjoy the warm weather with this, and hopefully you'll get a chance to see maybe a torrid or two. I mean, you won't get a chance to see many of them, but one bright fireball can certainly take your breath away. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. Okay, next one, please, Chris. So at the Starfest party this year at the end of August, I was the really fortunate recipient of the Grand Door Prize, which was a Skywatcher 82 millimeter f6.45 Evolux apochromatic refractor seen here. Mount not included, by the way, but a very nice scope, and certainly shocked me when my name was called, because I never win stuff like that. So I guess the universe was smiling on me that night. Anyway, we've had some pretty decent skies in September and October this year, so I've had a few chances to give the telescope a workout. Next one, please. So this is my first deep sky object I tried to observe and capture with this telescope. It's Messier 33, the Triangulum Galaxy. This is the second closest large galaxy to us. It's 3.2 million light years away, with a diameter of about 50,000 light years, or about half that of our own Milky Way galaxy. The image itself is a stack of 12 90-second exposures for a total exposure time of 18 minutes. And it was taken with that telescope and a Canon RP full-frame sensor on HEQ5 mount. Next one, please. Okay, there we go. So the second major target I tested this scope on was Messier 31, and it's the season of Messiers here. The Andromeda Galaxy, and it's the closest large galaxy to us. It's about 2.5 million light years distant, so a little bit closer than M33. And it has a diameter of about 150,000 light years, or about the same as our own Milky Way galaxy. This image is a stack of 15 subframes, and those ranged from about 50 seconds to 300 seconds for a total exposure time of 52 minutes. It was taken again with the Evolux scope, and this time with a Canon 7DD, which is an APS-C crop sensor, again on the HEQ5 mount. So far, I'm pretty pleased with the results of this telescope. Visually, just observing brighter deep sky targets like the galaxies here, and certainly on things like the moon, and even the planets with a 2-power Barlow. It's giving me some pretty nice results. So with a focal length of 530 millimeters, I'm looking forward to observing and imaging a wide variety of larger deep sky objects with this fine instrument. And its compact size, I think, should make for a pretty nice travel scope. It also came in a nice aluminized heavier duty case there, so it can take the bumps and knocks that are typical of your cargo in a long distance road trip. All right, so for my last two images, I want to give you folks a sneak peek at what we can expect to do with the 14-inch Paul Commission telescope, and provide a quick status update. So this is obviously M42. Most of you will recognize this. It's the Great Orion Nebula, and again, it was taken with the Canon 70D, which is a DSLR with an APS-C crop sensor. So the reason I mention all these details is to give you an idea of what we can expect from this scope. This is actually just a single capture. It was actually one of my test images, because I've been doing a fair bit of work out on the scope trying to resolve our last technical hitches over the last couple of months. And so this was a single capture that I did on one of those evenings. So it hasn't been, and it also hasn't been cropped. So this shows you the full extent of something like the Orion Nebula when you shoot it with a DSLR with a cropped sensor. The shot itself was a 5-minute exposure, and I was very pleased with this because this was one of the first shots that I took after we resolved the auto guiding issues that we've been having with the 14-inch scope. So I'm very happy to let you know that the auto guiding issues have been resolved. Most of the hardware stuff is good now. The last thing that we're working on, and I've got some help from some hardy volunteers that don't mind us staying up too late at night. The last thing we're working on is trying to get that internal star map to the accuracy that we need, so that we can basically put a camera on the scope and use the scope's own control to say, go to M this or NGC that, and it will put that object on your sensor. So that's where we're at. That's the last issue that we've got to deal with, and hopefully that will be forthcoming very shortly. So the last image I got is this one. What I wanted to do, this was the same night as the M42 image. but a much fainter target. This is the Running Man Nebula, and it's just north of M42. And the reason I chose this is it's a pretty object. And again, this is an uncropped image taken with the 7DD. But the reason I chose this is that it's a much fainter target than the Orion Nebula. You saw in the last image there how vivid and bright and everything else the Orion Nebula is, because it is such an intrinsically bright nebula, and it shows up quite well in DSLR, even relatively short DSLR exposures. But the Running Man is different. It's the Running Man there's dark nebulosity that runs through there mixed with reflection nebula, as you can see. The very bright B-class bluish stars there are really lighting up the gas there and causing the beautiful reflection of blues that we see there. So like M42, this object is about 1,600 light years from here. And the reason this just made my night. It thrilled me because I only took 3 exposures. Again, I wasn't looking to do a lot of deep sky imaging. This was just for testing. But the 3 exposures that I did take were 300 seconds, 600 seconds, and 900 seconds. So 5, 10, and 15 minutes of exposure with the auto guider. And as you can see, it's pretty tight, which really gave me a lot of faith that the mount can still do her thing. We just got to teach her how to look at the stars and recognize where she's looking at and go to where she's asked to go. So that is our last step. And hopefully when we have that resolved, we've already got a couple of volunteers, including Mick as well, who would like to come out. And I hope you can come out in the wintertime, Mick, or it gets a bit cooler. We'll see. But we're hoping to be able to make this available just as soon as we get that pointing issue rectified, because everything else is working good. So fingers crossed, and I'll give you another update in about 4 weeks. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul, and we'll hand things back to Mick to go through the observing challenges.
And thank you to Chris and everyone that's made their reports.
I should make a comment that Oscar should be particularly pleased tonight. I haven't studied this, I can't say it for fact, but I think we've had more images tonight of the observing challenges than I've ever seen in a meeting. So, Oscar, you've encouraged people to get out and observe these.
Well, yeah, but I mean, half of them were from Oscar, so. Anyway, on the point of observing reports, given this fabulous weather, I'm expecting a massive crop of observations for the December meeting, and I'm adjusting the meeting schedule accordingly. So there we go.
Starting with the eclipse.
So many. Okay, so we don't need to recap last month's challenges. They've already been handled. The challenges this month, I'm calling the P challenges, as distinct from Oscar's Halloween challenges. P because basically they're all in Pegasus and Pisces. Starting with the beginner challenge, NGC 7814, an edge-on spiral, colloquially known as the little sombrero. You can see the details there. Next, please. Intermediate challenge. I think this is a cool one, a pair of colliding spirals in Pisces. We've seen colliding galaxies in some of the advanced challenges before. It's nice to see one that's accessible as an intermediate challenge. So that could be fun. Next, please. NGC 7357. A spiral galaxy in Pegasus. Again, you can see the details there. And the lunar challenge, obviously the eclipse. 8th of November, be up bright and early, and looking forward to a large crop of presentations. Next one, there's the summary. Next slide, please. Fred Lossing Observatory, open for business. Members are entitled to use the facilities there, to bring their own equipment, to get training on the equipment that's available. The next Star Party will be on November 26th, and that's usually a good time to show up and have someone like Taras wheel back the roof on the roll-off observatory and start to get a feel for how these facilities, these resources that all members are able to access can actually work to your benefit. And by the way, Paul, yes, I'm happy to be out there as guinea pig number 2 or quokka number 2 or whatever. Club information, as Andrea mentioned earlier, all the contact details for FLO, the book library, the equipment library, and so on, are available on our fabulously well-provisioned website. Just note, we have been previously touting subsidized subscriptions to magazines such as Sky and Telescope and Astronomy. Really, that seems to have fallen out of use. So as of next month, that won't be on this list. And then, thank you. We hit a peak attendance of 75, according to Chris. Particular thanks to our invited guest speaker, Dr. Hilding Neilson, to all our observers presenting their reports, and especially thanks to the RASC National Office for their provision of these Zoom facilities. Suggestions, criticisms, to me at meetingchair@ottawa.rasc.ca. Next meeting, Friday, 2nd December, emphasizing it is our annual general meeting. It is your opportunity to put democracy into action. It will be a Zoom webinar with facilities for voting on those critical questions of how we get 4 council candidates into 3 positions. With that, I will wish you.
Well, just to be clear, Mick, the AGM is only a small part of the meeting. The meeting will still have lots of other talks and observations and the full agenda.
Including 64 million observations of the lunar eclipse. Thank you, Chris. Yes, I agree. So with that, I will wish you all good night. Thank you for joining, and see you on the 2nd of December. Cheers.